The following historical narrative is based on extensive research using primary sources, scholarly publications, and archaeological evidence. While certain aspects of Ethiopian military traditions, particularly regarding animal warfare, have limited documentation in formal academic literature, this presentation focuses on historically verified events and draws from the most credible sources available. Historical interpretations may vary, and ongoing archaeological research continues to expand our understanding of these remarkable events. March 1st, 1896. The highlands of northern Ethiopia echo with the clash of steel and the thunder of gunfire. When the smoke clears, over 7,000 Italian soldiers lie dead or wounded, a 70% casualty rate that would send shockwaves across Europe and forever change the course of African history. This was Adwa, the battle that shattered the myth of European invincibility and proved that a unified African force could not only resist colonial conquest, but decisively defeat a modern European army. But Adwa was just the beginning of Ethiopia's extraordinary resistance story. For over 4 decades, from the 1880s through the 1940s, Ethiopia would stand as Africa's unconquered fortress, employing military innovations so ingenious and tactics so unexpected that they would inspire anti-colonial movements across the globe. I'm about to take you inside one of history's most remarkable tales of resistance, a story that challenges everything you thought you knew about the colonial period in Africa. While European powers carved up an entire continent during the infamous Scramble for Africa, one nation not only survived but thrived, becoming a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples worldwide. By 1914, when the colonial dust had settled, 90% of Africa was under European control. Only 2 nations remained independent: Liberia, protected by American interests, and Ethiopia, the sole indigenous African state to maintain its sovereignty through sheer military brilliance and unbreakable will. Before we dive into this extraordinary chronicle, I want you to know this isn't just another history lesson. These events changed the world. They inspired Marcus Garvey, influenced W.E.B. Du Bois, and gave hope to liberation movements from Jamaica to South Africa. The red, yellow, and green of Ethiopia's flag became the colors of Pan-African pride, adopted by nation after nation as they fought for their own independence. If this kind of deep historical storytelling resonates with you, consider subscribing, because there's so much more untold African history that deserves to be heard. To understand how Ethiopia achieved the impossible, we must begin with one man, Sahle Mariam, who would become Emperor Menelik II. His story reads like something from an epic novel, but every detail is historically documented. Born in 1844 as a prince of Shewa, Sahle Mariam's life changed forever when he was just 11 years old. Emperor Tewodros II invaded his kingdom, and the young prince was captured and taken to the mountain fortress of Amba Magdala. For nearly a decade, he lived as a royal prisoner, but this captivity became his greatest education. Within those fortress walls, Sahle Mariam observed Tewodros's dedication to modernizing Ethiopia. He watched the emperor's efforts to unify the fractured kingdoms, studied his military innovations, and critically learned from his mistakes. When the British expedition under General Napier stormed Magdala in 1868, the young prince saw firsthand how European military technology could overwhelm traditional forces. But here's where Menelik's genius emerged. Instead of being intimidated by European superiority, he became obsessed with understanding and matching it. After escaping during the British assault, he returned to Shewa with a revolutionary vision: He would modernize Ethiopia's military not by abandoning traditional strengths, but by combining them with cutting-edge European technology. What happened next was perhaps the most sophisticated arms procurement operation in 19th-century Africa. According to the historian Teklet Sadiq Mekaria's meticulous research, Menelik orchestrated a decades-long campaign to stockpile military resources that would astonish even modern strategists. He dispatched engineers to Germany and Great Britain, established direct purchasing relationships with Italian arms dealers, and exploited European rivalries to secure the latest weaponry. The numbers are staggering. By the time of Adwa, Ethiopia possessed approximately 189,000 modern rifles and over 2 million bullets. To put this in perspective, most European armies of the period would have envied such an arsenal. But Menelik's strategy went far beyond mere acquisition. He was building the foundation for something unprecedented in African history. France provided military advisors who taught Menelik's commanders European tactics and battlefield coordination. Italy, ironically, sponsored Ethiopia's inclusion in the Brussels Act of 1890, legally enabling massive arms imports. The Italians believed they were cultivating a client state, but Menelik was playing a far more sophisticated game. He understood that military strength alone wouldn't guarantee victory. Unity was essential, and Ethiopia's ethnic and regional divisions presented a massive challenge. Through strategic marriages, political alliances, and careful power-sharing arrangements, Menelik gradually welded together a coalition that included Empress Taitu, Ras Wale, King Tekle Haimanot of Gojam, and dozens of other regional leaders who had historically been rivals. By 1895, when the inevitable clash with Italy approached, Menelik had achieved something remarkable: a unified Ethiopian state with a modern military infrastructure, commanded by leaders who understood both traditional African warfare and contemporary European tactics. The path to Adwa began with one of history's most consequential translation errors, or perhaps deliberate deception. In May 1889, while civil war raged in northern Ethiopia following Emperor Johannes IV's death, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchale with Italy. On the surface, this seemed like a standard border agreement. The treaty defined boundaries between Ethiopia and Italian Eritrea, guaranteed safe passage for Ethiopian goods, and established diplomatic protocols. But hidden within Article 7 lay a linguistic trap that would ultimately trigger war. The Amharic version of the treaty stated that Ethiopia could use Italy for diplomatic communications with other European powers. The Italian version declared that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italy, effectively making Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. For 6 years, this deception went undetected, while Italy proclaimed to European capitals that Ethiopia was under Italian protection. During this period, Menelik consolidated his empire, expanding southward into Oromo territories and building the military machine that would soon shock the world. The truth emerged in 1893, when Menelik discovered Italy's false claims. His response was swift and uncompromising. He publicly renounced the entire treaty and began mobilizing for war. But this wasn't the desperate scramble of a doomed nation. It was the calculated preparation of a master strategist. On September 17, 1895, Menelik issued his famous call to arms, a document that reveals both his political sophistication and deep understanding of his people's psychology. Now an enemy that intends to destroy our homeland and change our religion has come crossing our God-given frontiers. Now, with the help of God, I will not allow him to have my country. You, my countrymen, I have never knowingly hurt you, nor have you hurt me. Help me, those of you with zeal and willpower. Those who do not have the zeal for the sake of your wives and your religion, help me with your prayers." This wasn't merely a call for military support. It was a masterpiece of propaganda that transformed a border dispute into a holy war for Ethiopian independence. Within months, over 100,000 warriors began converging from across the empire. Meanwhile, Italy was making fatal miscalculations. Italian commanders, drawing on their recent conquest of Libya and their knowledge of other European victories in Africa, expected to face poorly organized tribal forces armed with spears and outdated muskets. General Oreste Baratieri confidently predicted a quick campaign that would restore Italian prestige after earlier humiliations in Africa. Intelligence failures compounded Italian arrogance. As the Ethiopian army marched north, Italian scouts consistently underestimated its size, organization, and equipment. When reports suggested Menelik commanded over 100,000 men, Roman military leaders dismissed them as impossible exaggerations. By February 1896, both armies faced each other across the rugged terrain of northern Ethiopia. The Italians, commanding approximately 25,000 troops, including Italian regulars and Eritrean askari, occupied strong defensive positions around the towns of Adagrat and Adwa. But their supply lines stretched dangerously long. Local populations had turned hostile, and political pressure from Rome demanded immediate action. Menelik, meanwhile, had achieved something unprecedented in African military history. He had assembled, equipped, and coordinated the largest indigenous army the continent had ever seen, commanded by experienced leaders who understood both local terrain and European tactics. Dawn, March 1st, 1896. In the hills surrounding Adwa, the largest military confrontation between European and African forces was about to begin. What happened over the next 8 hours would reverberate across continents and inspire generations of anti-colonial resistance. General Baratieri's battle plan seemed sound on paper. His forces would advance before dawn, occupy strategic mountain passes, and force Menelik to attack uphill against prepared positions. 3 Italian brigades would move simultaneously, surrounding the Ethiopian forces and cutting off retreat routes. But military plans rarely survive contact with reality, and this one disintegrated almost immediately. In the pre-dawn darkness, Brigadier General Albertone's advance brigade overshot its assigned position and marched directly into the Ethiopian encampment. Rather than achieving tactical surprise, the Italians had walked into a trap. As sunrise revealed their predicament, Ethiopian forces commanded by Ras Makonnen and Fitarari Gebeyehu immediately surrounded the isolated brigade. The 2nd Italian column, under General Arimondi, advanced to support Albertone, but found itself caught in separate engagement with forces led by Ras Mengesha Johannes. Instead of a coordinated 3-pronged assault, the Italians were fighting 3 desperate, isolated battles. Ethiopian tactics proved devastatingly effective. Rather than frontal assaults against superior firepower, Menelik's commanders used the terrain to outflank Italian positions, forcing them to fight in multiple directions simultaneously. The legendary Ethiopian cavalry, led by Ras Mikael's Volo Aroma warriors, repeatedly charged Italian flanks, disrupting formations and creating panic. But perhaps most crucially, Ethiopian forces demonstrated something European military observers had deemed impossible: complex battlefield coordination across multiple ethnic groups and regions. Empress Teitu commanded her own forces with fierce effectiveness, while traditional rivals like the leaders from Tigray, Gojam, and Shewa fought as a unified army. The 3rd Italian Brigade, under General Mida, made a fatal error that sealed their fate. Attempting to find high ground, they became separated from the main force and were systematically destroyed by Ethiopian units commanded by Negus Tekle Haimanot. By mid-afternoon, Italian resistance collapsed completely. What had begun as an organized military advance became a desperate retreat that quickly turned into a rout. Ethiopian forces pursued the fleeing Italians for miles, capturing massive quantities of weapons, supplies, and prisoners. The casualty figures tell the story. Approximately 70% of Italian forces were killed, wounded, or captured. Over 4,000 Italian and Eritrean soldiers died, with another 2,000 wounded and 1,500 taken prisoner. Ethiopian losses, while significant, were proportionally much smaller, between 3,000 and 7,000 casualties from a force exceeding 100,000. But beyond the numbers lay something more profound. Adwa shattered fundamental assumptions about European superiority and African military capability. For the first time in the colonial era, a European army had been not merely defeated, but annihilated by indigenous African forces. News of the disaster reached Rome within days, triggering political chaos. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi's government fell immediately. Angry crowds rioted in Italian cities, and international prestige plummeted. European military experts struggled to explain how a primitive African army had achieved such a devastating victory. The psychological impact extended far beyond Italy. Across Africa, colonized peoples heard whispered accounts of Ethiopian victory and began to believe that European domination wasn't inevitable. In the Americas, Marcus Garvey would later write that Adwa proved Africa for the Africans, while W.E.B. Du Bois called it a turning point in the global struggle for racial equality. Adwa's victory rested not just on modern weapons and brilliant tactics, but on uniquely Ethiopian military traditions that had evolved over centuries. These innovations, some verifiable through historical records and others preserved in oral tradition, reveal a military culture unlike anything else in Africa. The relationship between Ethiopian warriors and the natural world ran deeper than simple environmental awareness. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that Ethiopian forces developed sophisticated methods of incorporating local fauna into their military strategies, though the exact extent remains a subject of ongoing research. The practice of using beehives as weapons, while not extensively documented in formal military records, appears in multiple oral traditions and later historical accounts. The concept was tactically brilliant. Bees, when disturbed, would create chaos among enemy formations, particularly affecting horses and forcing infantry to break ranks. Whether this tactic was specifically employed against Italian mechanized units in later conflicts requires further archaeological investigation, but the underlying military innovation demonstrates the creative problem-solving that characterized Ethiopian resistance. Lions held special significance in Ethiopian military culture, serving both symbolic and potentially practical roles. The Lion of Judah wasn't merely a royal emblem. It represented the fierce independence that Ethiopian warriors carried into battle. While claims of trained war lions require careful historical verification, the cultural importance of these animals in Ethiopian military identity is well documented in royal chronicles and artistic representations. More concretely established is Ethiopia's sophisticated intelligence network. Ethiopian commanders possessed detailed knowledge of enemy movements, supply lines, and tactical weaknesses long before formal engagements began. This intelligence advantage proved crucial at Adwa, where Menelik's forces anticipated Italian movements and positioned themselves accordingly. The imperial military organization itself represented centuries of evolution. Unlike European armies with rigid hierarchical structures, Ethiopian forces operated through a complex system of regional commands that maintained both unity and flexibility. Each regional leader brought specialized skills: Tigrayan mountain warfare expertise, Oromo cavalry tactics, Amhara administrative coordination, creating a military machine greater than the sum of its parts. Weapons technology followed similar patterns of adaptive innovation. While European rifles provided the backbone of Ethiopian firepower, traditional weapons remained important. Ethiopian smiths modified imported firearms, adapted ammunition supplies, and maintained backup arsenals of spears, swords, and shields that proved invaluable in close combat. Perhaps most importantly, Ethiopian military culture emphasized endurance and logistical sophistication. European armies required complex supply trains and base camps, but Ethiopian forces could live off the land for extended periods, moving faster and striking where enemies least expected. This military tradition continued to evolve through the early 20th century. When Italy launched its second invasion in 1935 under Mussolini, Ethiopian forces again demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Though ultimately overwhelmed by superior numbers and chemical weapons, Ethiopian resistance continued throughout the occupation period, eventually contributing to Italian defeat during World War II. The guerrilla tactics employed during this later period, including the famous resistance movements led by figures like Bele Zeleke, incorporated lessons learned from both Adwa and evolving military technologies. Whether specific incidents involving beehives against armored vehicles occurred as described in popular accounts remains historically unclear, but the spirit of innovation and adaptation they represent certainly characterized Ethiopian resistance. To fully understand Ethiopia's achievement, we must place it within the broader context of European colonialism in Africa. The period from 1884 to 1914, known as the Scramble for Africa, represented one of history's most rapid and comprehensive conquests of an entire continent. The 1884 Berlin Conference, attended by 14 European nations but no African representatives, literally divided Africa on paper. European diplomats, many of whom had never set foot on the continent, drew arbitrary borders that ignored ethnic boundaries, traditional kingdoms, and geographical realities. These artificial lines, many of them perfectly straight, still define African national borders today. The statistics are staggering. In 1870, Europeans controlled just 10% of African territory, mostly coastal trading posts and southern African settlements. By 1914, that figure had risen to 90%. Ancient kingdoms that had existed for centuries, the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Congo, the Sokoto Caliphate, fell to European armies equipped with repeating rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Several factors enabled this unprecedented conquest. The Industrial Revolution provided Europeans with overwhelming technological advantages, from steamships that could navigate African rivers to telegraph systems that coordinated military campaigns across vast distances. Medical advances, particularly quinine's effectiveness against malaria, allowed European armies to survive in previously lethal tropical environments. But technology alone doesn't explain European success. Political fragmentation proved equally important. African societies, while often militarily sophisticated, typically lacked the large-scale political unity necessary to resist coordinated European invasions. Traditional rivalries between ethnic groups or kingdoms often worked to European advantage, as colonial powers employed divide-and-conquer strategies with devastating effectiveness. Ethiopia succeeded where others failed for several interconnected reasons. Geography provided natural advantages. The highland terrain favored defensive warfare and hindered European logistics. But many other African societies possessed similar geographical benefits without achieving Ethiopian success. More crucially, Ethiopia maintained political unity during the critical period of European expansion. While other African regions fragmented under pressure, Menelik's diplomatic genius welded together potential rivals into a formidable coalition. His timing proved perfect. Unification occurred just as European pressure intensified, creating maximum resistance at the moment of maximum threat. Ethiopia's Christian identity also provided unexpected advantages. Unlike Muslim or traditional African societies, Ethiopia could claim ancient ties to European civilization, making complete subjugation ideologically problematic for some European powers. This didn't prevent Italian invasion attempts, but it complicated European justifications for conquest. International law, such as it existed in the 1890s, also worked in Ethiopia's favor. After Adwa, European nations found themselves legally obligated to recognize Ethiopian independence. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, formally acknowledged Ethiopian sovereignty and established diplomatic relations between Ethiopia and European powers as equals. The psychological impact of Ethiopian independence extended far beyond Africa. In the Caribbean, Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement drew direct inspiration from Ethiopian resistance. In the United States, African-American intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois saw Ethiopia as proof that African civilizations could equal or surpass European achievements. Perhaps most significantly, Ethiopian success provided a template for future anti-colonial resistance. The techniques pioneered by Menelik, combining traditional strengths with modern technology, building inter-ethnic coalitions, exploiting European rivalries, would be employed by liberation movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America throughout the 20th century. Even during the darkest period of colonial rule, Ethiopia remained a beacon of hope. When Italian forces briefly occupied the country from 1936 to 1941, the resistance movement that ultimately expelled them drew strength from the Adwa legacy. Emperor Haile Selassie's address to the League of Nations in 1936, warning against fascist aggression, resonated precisely because it came from the leader of Africa's unconquered nation. The victory at Adwa created ripple effects that continue to shape our world today. Within months of the battle, the red, yellow, and green of Ethiopia's flag began appearing in anti-colonial movements from Jamaica to Ghana. These colors, representing the rich earth, golden sunshine, and eternal hope of African independence, became the unofficial flag of global Pan-Africanism. In intellectual circles, Ethiopian independence forced a complete reconsideration of racial theories that had justified European expansion. If Africans could organize complex military campaigns, defeat European armies, and govern sophisticated states, how could Europeans claim natural superiority? The very existence of independent Ethiopia undermined the ideological foundations of colonialism. The practical lessons of Ethiopian resistance spread throughout the colonized world. Vietnamese independence leaders studied Menelik's tactics against the French. Indian nationalists examined Ethiopian diplomatic strategies. Even European military academies incorporated Adwa's lessons into their curricula, recognizing that traditional colonial warfare assumptions had been permanently shattered. But perhaps most importantly, Ethiopia demonstrated that resistance was possible. For millions of colonized peoples who had begun to believe European domination was inevitable, news of Ethiopian victory provided crucial psychological encouragement. The impossible had been achieved. A European army had been not merely defeated, but destroyed by African forces. This inspiration proved particularly powerful in the African diaspora. In Harlem, Jamaica, and London, communities of African descent drew strength from Ethiopian achievement. Bob Marley's references to Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, the Rastafarian movement's adoption of Ethiopian symbolism, and countless other cultural expressions trace their origins directly to the legacy of Adwa. The modern implications extend well beyond symbolism. Ethiopia's successful resistance preserved cultural and political traditions that might otherwise have been destroyed under colonial rule. The survival of ancient Ethiopian Christianity, unique architectural traditions, and indigenous governmental systems provided crucial continuity that other African societies lost during the colonial period. Today, as we grapple with questions of sovereignty, resistance to oppression, and the rights of small nations to determine their own destinies, Ethiopia's story remains remarkably relevant. The techniques that enabled Ethiopian victory, building coalitions across ethnic lines, combining traditional strengths with modern innovations, exploiting divisions among more powerful enemies, continue to offer lessons for anyone facing overwhelming odds. The archaeological and historical research continues to reveal new dimensions of this extraordinary story. Every year, scholars uncover additional evidence of Ethiopian military sophistication, political complexity, and cultural achievements that challenge Western assumptions about African capabilities. But at its heart, Ethiopia's triumph represents something timeless and universal. Proof that determination, unity, and strategic thinking can overcome even the most daunting challenges. In an age when so many people feel powerless against larger forces, the victory at Adwa reminds us that the impossible sometimes becomes inevitable when ordinary people refuse to surrender their freedom. The echoes of that March morning in 1896 still reverberate today, in every independence movement, every struggle against oppression, every moment when the powerless discover their strength. Ethiopia showed the world that David could indeed defeat Goliath, and that lesson has never been more relevant than it is right now.